Hi, everybody. Welcome to the CLIMARTE Gallery. I'd like to, on behalf of CLIMARTE, acknowledge that we are on the lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation and pay respects to elders past, present and emerging. In doing so, to acknowledge that everything about their culture always connected life, and that they have always led with exactly the sort of culture that we need to get ourselves out of the climate emergency. So looking at it through that lens, I do think that a lot of what we're going to be talking about is actually learning from Indigenous cultures and learning how to live in harmony with the earth. So, it's a great pleasure to have you all here. It's so fantastic to engage in these sort of conversations. We're going to treat it like a gathering and like a public conversation. We have many of the artists, so I'd like to pass around the microphone. Oh, I should say that I'm Deborah Hart, by the way, so I'm with CLIMARTE. And let you all introduce yourselves and speak a little bit about the work that you've contributed to this exhibition and why you responded to the theme, which is basically looking at the intersections between money and politics, information and power, and how we could radically turn things around so that we have an economy that actually nurtures people and nature rather than destroys it for maximum profit. So, Sarah.
Okay, thanks, Deb. Hi, my name's Sarah Metzner, and it's great to be here with you all on this gallery. This is a collaborative project that is called Vessels of the Diaspora, and it started for me about 30 years ago when I did my master's. Then the project was Vessel as a Metaphor. And since then, several things have happened. We had the refugee crisis, and simultaneously I started working in education, and I worked initially at Thornbury Primary School, which is a school that has, since the 40s, probably the highest inner city First Nations community of students, and the Warrawong language program and cultural program there. And that's where I started collaborating with Nikki Fletcher, who's also a Steiner Craft teacher that helped and collaborated on the project. And then I worked at Manavale Primary School for 6 years out in Werribee, and that's one of Melbourne's most lowest socio-economic schools, disadvantaged schools, and it's an extraordinary melting pot for children from all over the world, including lots of refugee children. And so this crisis was happening, and I was working with these children and their families and the issues around that. And then during this same period of time, 10-year period, I developed a friendship with Quinn Tram, who I've just been talking to on the way here, who is a Vietnamese woman who 6 times with her family as a child from Vietnam tried to catch boats and was unsuccessful every time, including her being put into prison as a 6-year-old, separated from her family, and she ended up, her father came out as a refugee, and she came out as a migrant eventually. And so I sort of had these personal experiences with children from many different cultures, and simultaneously we've had all the climate disasters and emergencies, particularly heightened in the last decade. And I kept seeing these vessels filled with figures that were made by these children, which kind of cuts through the politics of, that we get lost in around climate and around refugees. And I just thought children's sense of wonder and sense of community inclusion and this school at Werribee, as I said, is probably, you know, some of the kids that have got the least opportunity that you probably could find here in Victoria, but their capacity to be inclusive and care for each other was just extraordinary. And I sort of thought if their voices, that wonder, could be part of this project. So Nikki from also Sophia Mundi, Steiner School, kind of thought it'd be great to get the Steiner community, having also worked in that community with children with nature, and the use of felting and wools and natural dyes. And so the materiality is really important. And then there's Thornbury Primary School and there's Manavale and there's Flax, lots of Oceanic Māori children that have been part of the project as well. So it's sort of referencing the flow, if you like, of communities throughout the world, which will increasingly occur in response to climate issues, in response to refugee issues, but hopefully through a humane perspective, through children's sense of wonder. And so it's been really wonderful to install it in this context and have the piece reverberating on sort of in amongst everyone else's works with all the issues that have been expressed here. So hopefully that encapsulates just, thank you.
Hi everyone, I'm Pam Kleemann-Passi. My work is on the other side of that wall, Trolley Trouble in Troubled Times, which is a documentation of a Extinction Rebellion action in August last year addressing food security. It's a kind of interesting image because it's very colourful and vibrant, but the underpinning narrative is quite distressing to come to terms with. And I love the fact that there's a very dark, heavy cloud in the background, kind of looming as the, the foreboding kind of issue that we need to deal with. I grew up in the Riverland area of South Australia on the River Murray, and my family, I'm a fourth or fifth generation German heritage, and my family and many others probably cleared half of the mallee in South Australia for farming. I grew up in a place on a fruit orchard, so we had all the fruit we ever wanted. My mother had a vegetable garden that was the size of a city block. We didn't want for anything. Everything was fresh produce. We thought that was fantastic, and we thought it was daggy as well. We didn't really think about the downside of the way all of that food was produced and the chemicals used in, the fertilisers and the sprays and, all of that stuff, which has majorly contributed to what's happening. The kind of erosion of so many aspects of life on the land, and without any consideration at all for any Indigenous land conservation ideas at all. I'm very pleased that the image actually won the People's Choice Award for the Coonahan Gallery's Mary Beck Summer Show at the end of last year, so that was a real surprise, actually. It's not surprising given that, a lot of the audience who saw that exhibition, did participate in that particular action. We all know the flow of food and the flow of money and the kind of corporatisation of food and the way food is produced in an industrialised way, which is so detrimental to the health of the land and the health of the species and the health of us. So there's lots of lessons to be taken away if the politicians will ever learn, and I'm not so sure that's going to happen in my lifetime anyway. So thank you very much.
Hello. My name's Carolyn Lewens, and my work is one of the videos projected, the blue and white one that's projected called Submerge the Coming Community. And it started off as a whole lot of still images that I called them my creatures. And I'd done a lot of work previously around environmental issues, particularly around rivers and water, wetlands and various river systems in regional Victoria, part of a big project called Watermarks. And each, I think it was quite unique in a way because the concept travelled rather than the work. So the concept was about water issues, but it's a long story, but for various reasons, I got a grant with a gallery that the director had just left, and the gallery said, well, I'm afraid you'll have to give your money back. And so I said, well, actually, it's in my name, I'm not going to give it back. And so
Not yours.
That's right. So I sent a letter to all the regional galleries in Victoria, well, lots of them, and said, I've got this project that's about water issues. I had a really big surprise response where a whole lot of different places said, we'll take it. And so the concept travelled, but the ideas were localised. We sort of would go and research what were the water issues in Geelong, and then we'd come up with something, and that happened to be about bridges and the history of the Barwon River. Another one was at the Sale Regional Gallery that was to do with, it was called Swamped, and there were lots of wetlands nearby, and I remember going into the wetlands feeling very swamped. And I also recognised my feelings with feeling swamped by data. So I made sure there was lots of data on the walls, and the images were all hanging, things that hung in the gallery, and you were meant to be swamped by both things, all the information, and by these 4 metre long hangings that sort of prevented you seeing a clear way out. So a lot of projects happen like that, and often I worked with environmental officers on a river or something like that. Anyway, I learnt a lot about life in the water, and when that project came to an end, I decided I would be a little bit more free and make what I would call my sea creatures or my pond creatures, or my aquatic creatures. So I had all these, and I was doing a PhD at the time, and I started arguing that these works were alive in a different system. I thought, I need to make an animation. I sort of wrote the script or the treatment. I know we've got a film professional here in Joe Lane. I didn't really know what I was doing, but I had this idea. I wanted them to move. Originally the video was meant to be projected onto the floor so that you look down into the water, and because my works are cameraless, they're made by the photogram, which is I place objects and materials on light-sensitive surfaces and put them out into the sun, and I use this really old photographic process called the cyanotype, which it became known as the blueprint. And so blueprints, engineers and architects' plans for things to come. So I feel like my ideas and my sea creatures or my water creatures were plans for things that might come. And so I fed the animator all these ideas, a kind of a script, a loose script, and lots of images, and we met regularly and talked a lot, and then we trialled things. And it evolved, and I was really excited by it. And then I suddenly realised, as novices do, that I needed sound. So I did the same thing, and if you listen to the sound, Pam actually gave me the name of a sound artist, and he worked at RMIT, and I said, this is what I'm doing, and I want you to do this. I don't want you to put the microphone in the water and just record the sounds. I want you to make them up. They're not real, but they need to be convincingly sort of imaginative real, so that people can be inspired.
Yes, you can hear it. I mean, we've turned it down for now.
Yes,
you can hear
and
it
the sound is fantastic. I was really excited. So it's sort of, if you really want to do things and you ask and you sort of go to the right people, magic happens. And I think I'm really still excited about it, and it's really nice to see it again. I made it a few years ago, and I love collaborating with other people, because you get things that you never imagined that are wonderful.
Thank you. I'm Linda Knight. I also have my work on the other side. It is Sudan 1956, or Anglo-Egyptian Sudan 1956, and it's part of a very large work, which is a counter-mapping of the British Empire, and the almost 200 nations that gained independence from the British Empire over the course of from its commencement, if you like. And so each work that is produced is a stitched work, and also a series of mappings in a repurposed big atlas, the kind of world atlas you'll get at home or in the school library or whatever. It will be a very long project, and it presents a kind of counter-narrative of British colonial history, and you can probably hear from my accent I am that history, and so a lot of my work is to do with reparative practice, and with very long-term projects, and a kind of slow practice. And the slow practice is the commitment that's required to kind of amending and facing up to one's culture and history, and the kind of colonial acts that have happened within my culture. And so each work is a mapping of the land as it was at the time of independence. So this particular one, the Sudan doesn't look like that anymore, because other things have happened since 1956. And so the country is now very different. We know that there's a lot of conflict going on in the Sudan and South Sudan, and so these kind of movements continue to happen. So I acknowledge that in the statement, but the work isn't about recent histories. It is very much about this notion of power, and the connection with the themes of the show are that the reasons for which countries were colonised by the British government, initially the British monarchy and then the British government, and it was rarely to do with an interest in the culture and the land and the people. It was to do with managing income streams and flows, and so kind of extractive wealth and gain. We know that very much here in Australia, but for example, Sudan was commandeered to maintain access to the Suez Canal. So it was about trade routes, and so the idea of lands just being taken over and plotted for the flow of wealth and the continuation of streams of power for things like conflict and the movement of armed forces through the world easily, without kind of having to negotiate different parliaments and things like that, is all captured in this work. I am a woman, and so a lot of the material practices I use are those kind of domestic textiles, and that's to kind of really address the complicity of women in the history of British colonisation and the practices that women have participated in to uphold colonisation. And it is often quite a masculine story. It is often, it's rarely kind of targeted towards the actions or the kind of complicit behaviours of women. And my work is very much about addressing that and the reparative practices that we need to do to think about how particularly white women have perpetuated those very aggressive takeovers and maintaining them. So it's the start of a project. I've got about 6 of them at the moment, and there will be 200 by the end. So it'll be a long project.
Hi, my name's Adam Stone, and I made the snails, which are in the other room. I was a little bit of a late invitation into the show. I run a gallery just around the corner, and Deb happened to come by and see these works and thought that they were an appropriate kind of inclusion into the exhibition. So,
Can they crawl up the street?
So the work's called Winners and Losers. So it draws that title from a cultural theory which imagines contemporary society as an inherent competition. So this is very much a kind of conceptual fabric within the late capitalist society that we exist willingly or non-willingly in I guess in our culture, and thinking about the ways in which we kind of navigate that space. So this iteration is a slightly more pared back version. The other iteration had kind of 40 different snails, some of which were kind of breaching the boundaries of the wall, some were moving in kind of different directions, and then there were also some which had been squashed at the bottom. So it was less so a kind of literal interpretation of, perhaps the ones up the top are the winners, the ones down the bottom are the losers, but more of a kind of metaphoric question, because this kind of hubristic tendency under that model is something that I'm very interested in, and the ways in which we are kind of cultivate these encouraged to cultivate these kind of brands through Instagram to kind of present ourselves as being this kind of desirable commodity, and it does kind of incite this kind of inherent competition, which kind of for me comes back to advertising and marketing, which primarily exists as a kind of means of making us feel inadequate so they can sell us goods. And I think it's quite fascinating the way in which we, through social media, have been encouraged to kind of mimic this pattern and kind of create our own kind of brands and inherent form of competing. And it's very difficult to kind of circumvent this language and this way of existing. And I think for me too, it's maybe on some kind of psychological level trying to come to terms with the fact that there's something very alluring about that, but then also knowing at the same time that there's something very inherently wrong too. So it's kind of trying to make sense of existing within this kind of sphere. I know Deb was quite interested in the snails as a metaphor too, to talk about the kind of pace in which social change is moving at this kind of slow but eventual kind of momentum, like the snail and the hare kind of thing. Snails also, I think, are quite interesting as a stand-in and as a metaphor. They're in a lot of creation stories across all sorts of different cultures. So I think there's something quite inherently fascinating about them. They're such strange creatures and they're so different to, I guess, us. You know, I think there's maybe some interesting connection that, you know, one of these kind of aliens, extraterrestrials that we've devised up, you know, you've got the armordized ones, but then you've got the ones with the weird antennas. You know, there's something inherently snail-like about them too. And the fact that the shell too has the, what do they call it, the golden proportions or whatever. Yeah, the golden ratio. Yeah, you know, is quite interesting too. And maybe the way that, the snails act as a kind of antithesis to this kind of late capitalist environment that we find ourselves in. The other thing too is they don't have their trails, and that was something I was kind of tossing around in my head as to how to resolve. I had originally thought it could be quite playful and fun to have these very lightly pigmented trails which kind of mapped how the snails moved around, but I found that to be a bit too theatrical, and that kind of without the trails, maybe the trails are implied or the absence of the trail becomes interesting because of the way in which I think we're so focused on the outcomes, be it being a winner or a loser, or this is good and this is bad, rather than focusing on the journey that is perhaps implied by the trail and the lovely paths that the trails can leave. And I know that's something for me as an artist too that I think is really important to reflect upon, because the way the system is set up is, you know, you have to apply for exhibitions, you have to apply for funding. There's never a moment where you can kind of take the time to appreciate the journey and where you're at. You always have to be planning for the next thing. Are you any good? Well, you're only as good as the next work or the next thing that you get. So I thought that was a kind of interesting meditation that might be somewhere there within the work.
My name's Jo Lane, and I'm on the committee at CLIMARTE, and I'm an artist. The work that Deb requested to be in here is behind you guys there. It's called The Listening Stones, and my work generally tries to articulate through drawing or sculpture feelings or thoughts or spaces that aren't there, and those stones are solidify the space around the ear and the head and the shoulder. And I did this work as a monument to the people who many years ago, I think about 5, it was first mooted, AGL wished to bring liquid gas in from overseas that Australia had sold overseas countries, buy it from there, bring it into Australia, into a beautiful Ramsar wetland bay called Western Port Bay, suck in seawater, these enormous ships, I can't even, the length of Bridge Road between here and Lennox, perhaps, each ship, suck in seawater, change the temperature of the liquid gas, chlorinate that seawater so it didn't affect the machinery within the ship, pump that seawater back out into this shallow bay, chlorinated and at 6 degrees different temperature. They would dig up a trench from Hastings to Melbourne to then pump the gas, and they said it would have no environmental effect. A number of people went to the very minor, very quietly announced information session in Hastings, and everyone went, whoa. And the people that were at that session were all ordinary people, more ordinary people who just went, this feels really wrong. And they started to investigate. There was no EES required, by the way, from the Victorian government. The AGL did not have to do an environmental effects statement. They were just informing the community of what was going to happen. Many incredible people, hundreds in fact, quietly, persistently lobbied and got the government to agree that AGL needed an EES. That was win number one. They went ahead and paid for consultants to write the...
Just so everyone knows, that's an environmental effects statement.
Yes, I thought I said that, sorry. To write the report, which came out very favourably for this effluence. And so many people wrote in to the government to say that we don't agree with that, and many biologists, marine biologists, Indigenous group, the Willamaraine Aboriginal Corporation from down there, psychologists, every field to do with health, spoke at a symposium that was conducted during COVID, so it was great. Everyone could look at it online. 10,000 people put in statements saying why this is wrong. And bless Richard Wynne, whose office was down here, he then overturned this disastrous environmental act, which was for a money-making system for shareholders of AGL under the guise of we need gas to power an economy in this state. That small work there, I put the idea to Mornington Peninsula Council for their Drift Arts Festival, and they liked it very much because they in fact paid $250,000 of ratepayers' money to fight that development. The government and the councils are often at loggerheads, and just so you know, the Victorian government is taking out of councils' hands any development proposals in the future. So councils will not have a say in developments. It's quite a dangerous thing in my view, and many councillors too in many different regional and city councils. Anyway, that's what the government wants to do, so they can say yes, a planning action is approved or not without consulting the community. Anyway, this piece was called The Listening Stones because it was the people who listened to Earth, who listened to their heart and soul and knew that this was a wrong development. So I'm very proud, and I wish each of the people whose stones I made of their head, Deb is one of them, I am one, Deb and I and a number of other angels went to stand on the beach down there as the climate angels, which the media was attracted to, which is the point. And in fact, that act, as well as Hinatera, is a woman who's in there, and she did a paddle out in the shape of a heart, which again, the Channel 7 and 9 helicopters was great media fodder to get the word out how wrong this was. So everyone did something in their own way, and that supported each other. And so this incredible groundswell of care. And as a flow of information from what corporates give to us and how we can talk to each other, and how with determined and clear objectives can be fought. Some lose. This particular one did win, and that's that little work there, The Listening Stones. Thank you.
Can I just add to that too, that day that the Climate Guardians gathered on the beach and took that image, it just happened to be the day that the federal government sent a delegation down because they were so convinced that the Victorian government was just going to tick the box that they came down to celebrate. I'm like, hi, ciao. So, sometimes I think those sort of community-driven projects, there's some kind of magic that just,
It was criminal what they were going to do. It was ecologically, environmentally criminal. And we have to say,
well
no,
done.
Don't do that.
Hi, I'm Louise Rippert. This is my piece here. It's called Reflect. I think first glance you can see it's quite reflective. It's a little bit like Jo's work in a way. It's about listening, but more about reflecting on ourselves and our own conscience and that space, that relationship that we have to the environment and what we know is the right thing to do. And sometimes that's not the easiest choice. When Deb asked me to be in the show, I was a little bit surprised but very happy. My work doesn't normally address environmental themes, and although I did say I do have one work which I think would work well, and it was made in 2018 when we were all, really beginning to think about the climate crisis and climate change, global warming. This was really coming into our everyday discussions. And it really was started when I was up in the Dandenongs, which is one place I get a piece of time with nature, and I was looking in this. It's a garden that's owned by the National Trust now, but it used to be a private garden, the Tyndall Garden, and I had remembered from childhood that these seed pods were somewhere in amongst the planted hydrangeas and everything. So I went to look for them, and I was by myself winter morning, and I thought, if I see them, I'm going to pinch them. And I did see them, and I pinched quite a few, and as I was coming out the gate, I ran into the park ranger, and I was just holding them, and we had a discussion about something, and then I just sort of quickly said, what are these called? And he looked at me and he said, honesty. What is it? Honesty. And I went, oh. And so I went home and I actually looked up what this plant was. I think it was the Lunara annua. And they only come up once a year. You only see them once a year in winter, after summer. And I don't know, does anybody know these? Yeah. They're very, appealing. They've got maybe 2 or 3 different layers, and they're
Like
papery and satiny, and as a child you could play games with about money, break them off, and this is your money and this is my money and I'm going to buy this, and shops or whatever. So straight away they're like coins. And so this is where my sort of normal work and then this idea kind of merge, in that most of my work's fairly meditative and time-consuming, and I do a lot of all-hand stitching, so there's a lot of sort of time to reflect, just the blarble in your head and whatever happened today, and I like to use silver as a sort of metaphor for consciousness, the sort of emptiness of consciousness and everything that appears in it, like the mirror. The mirror stays the same, but the contents change. And I thought, well, the world is in that mirror. The world is our environment, and that's incredibly important. And here's these little money seed pod things, and I looked up, about them, and they had different names, which were quite surprising. The Pope's money, Judas coins, in America, silver dollar. So they have all sorts of weird kind of undercurrents and tones, these names, which, go with what goes with money. Betrayal, deceit, attraction. And so these were the things that I thought about as I sewed these little seed pods on. And I liked the way that with the silver behind them, you could see both sides of the coin. So you had a choice, and we talk about that metaphor of, flipping a coin and leaving things to fate. And then I thought, this environmental issue is something that shouldn't be left to fate.
Thank you so much, all of you, for explaining your work so beautifully and articulately. Sorry, back to you. Yes, just to bring it all kind of together again, when I approached all of these different artists who I knew the work was so diverse, and yet they're all incredibly thoughtful and conscious and lovely, dependable people, I knew that bringing a show like this together would actually be the joy that it has been. But it is a tricky topic when you say, okay, we want to talk about money. We want to talk about a culture of greed and, and a self-serving culture that we've all been kind of co-opted into, that we have a culture this is the root cause of the climate emergency. So if we can't address an existential crisis like the climate emergency without addressing this culture that's causing it. So we got to Joe and I Joe helped me with the name because, I wanted to call it all sorts of radical things, the revolution, whatever. But I remembered that the word current and the word currency were tied, so looked into that history. So, yes, so currency is called currency because it is supposed to be like a current, and it evolved from the word curraunt, which evolved from a French word. So curraunt appeared in the 13th century, but basically it's about currency is supposed to flow. It is a medium of exchange, and we don't see much flow in our economy at the moment, and as a result we're seeing all sorts of, just the social fabric deteriorating. We have this bizarre, Lulu and I in a conversation about this work and about what could contribute, I was saying, like wealth hoarding, it's really weird, right? And, like all these bizarre tax avoidance schemes that people really it's really weird. Why don't we look at it like hoarding? Why don't we see this as a mental health issue? It's really problematic. And I don't think that the people who have so much money seem to be terribly happy. Look at Putin, he's allegedly the richest man in the world. Don't think it's going so well for him. Anyway, Lulu said, yeah, like cats, that's weird, if you hoard cats, you're a real weirdo. What a perfect analogy. So yeah, it was a really random theme. You all did such a brilliant job. And I would also encourage you to really read all of the artist statements, including the artist statements of all of the artists here too, because they're incredibly thoughtful and they really bring home this theme. There is, for example, Bronwyn Razem. She is a Gunditjmara artist. That is Tower Hill. So that is a celebration of possibly the oldest sustainable farming system. That's the one where the lava flows were used to create the eel traps in Western Victoria. You're all familiar with that? Yeah, it's absolutely beautiful work, and it speaks to where we could go, what an economy that's regenerative could look like.
On your little seeds, there are numbers. What do the numbers? What were your thoughts about the numbers?
Well, maths, even though I wasn't very good at it, is one way that we, or mathematicians, physicists, explain the universe. But it's infinite. Numbers go on infinitely, so it's just a pet topic of mine, the infinite. So not so much related to the topic of money, but more going back into that contemplation of ourselves in this world, and everything in this world is reflective of us, and the way that we see ourselves and see others and treat people, and so yeah.
Also little blue dots on the right, are they little eyes?
Yeah, They're little, they're not really Greek eyes, they're more just a metaphor for being aware and watching the contents. Yeah.
Adding on to that, there's the term, you always have to watch your money, which...
Oh, yeah. True. But I like the way, with the silver behind, you get to see there's two eyes. There's that split brain phenomenon. People with epilepsy, I don't know when it was in the 60s or something, they did an operation and they cut some part of the brain, and the right side of the brain kind of almost didn't know what the left side of the brain was doing. So it's about, how we can hide from ourselves too.
It's very difficult because we want things to change, but we don't want what we
There's
have
a sacrifice
to change
there.
too much.
Yep.
It's a very strange dichotomy we've found ourselves in, because we love comfort.
Absolutely.
Everyone works hard for it, and everyone kind of deserves it from every nation, and comfort comes at a cost, and how to balance
That discomfort when you realise that, somebody in Bangladesh only got paid, $2 a day in a sweatshop condition. Yeah, it's doesn't sit well.
We know economies can be hugely creative and regenerative. So, hence the theme for the conversation.
Yep.
And, the diversity of the work speaking to that. Jen Ray's work, for example, really speaks to what a regenerative, reworlded world could look like, and what artists' role is in that. We'd argue that artists really should be at the centre of many of these discussions, these plans for what a better future looks like, because artists are naturally complex system thinkers. They're not afraid to take risks and to experiment. They're honest. They're resourceful, enormously hardworking, and they're also people who have really been disadvantaged by the kind of neoliberal economy that limits access to life's basics in order to maximise profits. So, that's one of the key aims of CLIMARTE, has been to really help mobilise artists to have a voice and to elevate the voices of artists in these sorts of conversations. Anna is actually down from Sydney, and Anna's work was in our poster project, the one earlier in the year, which was last year. Oh my God, yeah. And Anna's a brilliant XR activist as well. So do you want to have a little chat about how you combine your role as an artist as well as a really, really, fearless activist?
I'd just like to say what a smart idea I thought that poster project was. It's like finding something, a whole diverse way of communicating the message. All 10 finalists getting their posters printed out and put up around the town. Very, very good. Well, my main question is, why can't we have something like this happening in Sydney? So I'd like to think that in some way something like that can happen, because, there's so much work in starting it, but if you can actually get it going, then I think the whole thing can build on itself. And certainly my time in Extinction Rebellion was very much about the arts and about the principles on which Extinction Rebellion has been founded. And it's all been very difficult. So I guess in Sydney, in our own ways, we just keep trying. But congratulations for having a gallery like this, because I think it's absolutely wonderful.
I wanted to ask Sarah and a little bit about obviously, what were the children's narratives as they were part of the process? Did you hear surprising things from them and how they interpreted it? Because it's such a beautiful way of connecting children with their, as you say, with the water, with the movement, with the vessels. So I'd love to hear about some of their views.
So disparity of voices, because you've got children from different communities. I worked with the children from Werribee, and the assistant principal asked the refugee children if they wanted to be part of the project, which they did, and they were sort of in one day that we worked together. And I was talking about Quintram before, my friend who's had this refugee background and has written policy for government around supporting children and wellbeing in early childhood and now in broadly education. And so, because she herself personally had been a refugee child, we talked a lot about the methodology of how to work with children with this content when they've experienced this trauma. So it was very complex. So we've got three different communities. We've got the Steiner community who they wanted to represent, their perspectives, what they'd learned, and their empathy, it seemed, through their project, through their representations. The children from Thornbury Primary School, so you've got, as I said earlier before, a strong First Nations community, so they've got their own experience of being dislocated from country and that trauma, so that was coming through. And there, as well as kind of quite a privileged cohort of different children that were part of that project as well, and a disability sector that worked on the project. So I wasn't party to those particular conversations, but these children made sort of the upcycled, really kind of colourful representations, and some of the mothers have got sort of their pearls and their jewels that they've taken on, and then others have got sort of like hats from different cultures, and others have got babies and children, and so they've represented it in kind of quite a quirky, sort of broad way. But the children I worked with were, it was very emotional. So for an example, this little boy, so I worked with Sudanese, Somalian, Ethiopian, Karen and Karenni refugees in particular. And like, it just comes to mind this boat here. So we worked with coconut husks and dyed fabrics and muslin and more of the natural materials. And it was, so this was a Sudanese boy who represented his father and mother in this project, whereas this little girl up here, Somalian child whose father was like the head of the refugee camp and was ostracised from all the refugee community because he had the most power in the camp and no one had enough. And so her story was, she's inside this vessel, there's a decapitated head, and it's a big, as Nikki and I, we were sort of, how would we, represent that? And every child is represented. So she really wanted to, her little brother, for the first 2 years of being at school, from being in a refugee camp, could not sit down for more than 5 seconds. His nervous system was completely shot. And then you had two little Ethiopian boys that just some stories are coming to mind that I sort of brought a whole lot of wellbeing processes. So when I presented it with these children, with talking with my friend Quintram, I delivered it as vessels of care. And so they were sharing that history whilst also building strategy on how to care for kind of trauma, if you like, and or emotional discord or challenges. And so the Ethiopian children were responding to some tarot prompts that I had, and then all the children got into small groups and talked about why they'd picked these cards, and like the Karenni girls had picked these really grieving cards, but they weren't specific; they were very symbolic. So they were just great prompts, and the Ethiopian boys were sharing stories together on how they miss their family so much, and every time they speak to their grandma, they cry, and then they looked at each other across from the table and were like, oh, I kind of prompted them and said, maybe you could really share some of these stories together because, you've got these histories. So lots of different stories, whereas the little Karenni children in this little boat here, so these are all naturally dyed muslins. This is a little mother and child. And these sort of forms are much less structured than these ones because the technique that I gave them was really quite unstructured specifically. So they're very emotive, and this is a lot as well up here. So lots of different stories came out. Yeah, lots of stories. And I'm going back to the school to do more with them. We're going to make animals. Because they wanted to put animals, and birds in there and bring them along, and that talks to the floods across history, not just in biblical terms, but through all cultures. There's been histories of floods, lots of oceanic cultures, and so I hope to build on that and how I work with the children, and then just summing that up, Quintram's sort of doing her research around how do you support families and communities in education. So kind of what's happening through this project and working on it together will go into her PhD research, which will hopefully go into some educational policy as well in terms of methodologies of how to work. Quite passionate about education. Having worked in the sector for 30 years, yeah.
And a number of children and families have come, and it's just...
And they are going to come on having a private viewing in the holidays. Yeah.
And it's... Yeah. It's so cute when they come in. And I'm working the other day, and a family came in, and these two little boys and Adam, they ran straight for those snails. I went, ah! So they were like, ah! Anyway, but yes, then they came running in here. It's gorgeous, and they can point to exactly where it is, and that's my friends, and that, it's really incredible engagement, social engagement.
To the previewing, the families actually come, because it'll be really great for them to see that history sort of also expressed through their eyes.
Is there a way for the different communities to come together, or are they doing it separately?
In time, do you mean, or in
the visit,
in the project, or
is that worked out, or?
Well, that sort of opens up another can of worms, so I won't talk too much about it. But education in the West is just struggling so severely at the moment. It's so under-resourced. There's schools that just can't get teachers over there. So to get, and there's a lot of trauma in a lot of the schools at the moment. So the principal just wanted the school community to come in a very safe context together. So there's lots of issues there around safety and care, But maybe down the track.
This is one of the reasons why I really wanted to include a work like this to talk to inequality, an extremely rich country. We just should not have this.
It's ridiculous inequality in our schools,
Yeah. Really, behind CLIMARTE, there is more work than you can possibly imagine. And as Jo said, she's on the committee. Our invigilators are just the most divine people. You've all met them. The committee. Behind the scenes, there is just so much work. So it really is a massive team effort. yeah. Thank you.